we're recording today's session. So we can share it with people who are broader who can't join us today. So I want to introduce Prateeksha Singh, who's a multidisciplinary practitioner who practices design, research, futures, and systems. We actually met a couple of years ago online through a different futuring event, and we didn't actually get to meet each other in person, but we kind of connected and stayed in touch. And she recently was in Sydney early in the year. We're able to see each other in person. And I've been dying to get her to speak at the meetup and just share about all the work that she's done. She's currently an independent innovation consultant with the UNDP, but she also has got other projects that she's done before, and she hopes to do it more in the future. And what I'll do now, I'll hand it over to Prateeksha Singh, and I'll stop sharing as well.
Hi, everybody. So nice to meet you. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. All right. It's very nice to meet all of you. It's Prateeksha or Prat for short, really, whichever one is easier. I always really start off nowadays with sharing that actually I forget, because it's been maybe several years now, that about 11 years ago, I was still an auditor and still have my license for some reason, although I hope to never practice it again. But the whole point being that actually a lot can change in 10, 11 years in your life. For me, that's definitely been true. I was in audit, and then I went to design school and started my own practice, and now do a lot of different work in the design research, foresight, innovation space. And for the last 3.5 years plus have been with the UN, with UNDP in particular. Currently, I'm based in Fiji just for about 6 months doing some UN projects here, and getting to experience a very different part of the world that I didn't really think I would get to live in and sort of experience. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity. I tend to start my talks off often with this quote because it really resonates for me, and it's a really good reminder, which is that whoever's in the room is the right people to have, and that all of us can only, there's a conversation in the room that only all of us can have. And so our goal is to hopefully find it and have it. And I don't know if you're familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown, but she's social activist out of the US, and a really interesting person to also get to know and read if you're interested in social movements around systems and foresight and bridging that with ecology. I wanted to start off by sharing that, of course, I was in corporate America. At one point, I never practiced foresight in corporate America. There was no real room for that at the time, but I've realized that the futures of audit is probably a very legitimate topic some people would want to discuss, but maybe not me. After I left corporate America, though, I was self-employed, and I immigrated to Canada by myself as an adult, and really took that as the jumping point to try very different things. And this is what Noun Project gave me as the icons for the nonprofit space, social enterprise, academia, government, and the arts. And I really leaped into trying very different things than what I had ever been exposed to in my career before. And in a lot of these spaces, I ended up practicing foresight, especially because I ended up going to design school about 2 years after I moved there. And I was at the OCAD University doing the Master's in Strategic Foresight and Innovation. When I found that program, as might be the case with some of you, I suppose, I obviously had heard of the words, strategic foresight and innovation, but I had never really seen them strung together, especially as a design program. So, especially when you come from accounting and finance. So really, it was a very eye-opening experience for me. And the biggest reason I wanted to do it was I wanted to challenge the way that I think business school and being an auditor had taught me to think and approach life. And I really wanted to sort of shock myself. And I think I did, because it was a profound experience for me in many ways, to be honest. And I'll go into a little bit more of the projects that I did at this time, but of course, as you know, after some of this work, I now work with the UN and have for the past, like I said, 3.5 years. And I think the next steps are question marks, but what I'm currently trying to do is trying to also get my UN work to overlap with doing some more creative work at the same time. It might have to do a little bit with the fact that, you know, a lot of my foresight work in the UN isn't exactly maybe as abstract or creative as I was just telling Tina and Sam before we started. So there's a little bit of a desire to re-engage in that space. So what I wanted to share with you is just some examples of a slew of different projects that I've worked on, and just give you a sense of how diverse this practice has looked for me, and how I hope it just gives ideas for those of you who either want to practice it or just maybe just share with you some of my work. And if you have synergies, I'd love to hear about it. Like I said, I did the master's in innovation and strategic foresight and innovation work. I was on the board of directors for the Association of Professional Futurists for over 3 years. They're one of the few organizations that have, you know, I guess a community or a virtual community that's more and more very global, you know, for those who want to engage in the foresight space more formally. So do check them out if that's of any interest. As part of being on the board with APF, I was also the chair for the APF sponsored Futures Festival, which was an online conference. And I co-chaired that for 4 years. And it's taken a break for the last 2 years, but it's going to come back next year. And I wanted to share, I'll share some of those things with you in a second in terms of what was the Futures Festival all about. But, you know, while I was doing all of this work as well with the board and before the board, I started my own practice. When I was in design school, at least in Toronto, the two main industries that were prominent for hiring graduates was banking and healthcare. And I really didn't want to go back to corporate. That was a commitment I had sort of made to myself when I left, you know, corporate America. And so I started Empathy Designs. It's still active. It was my practice where I wanted to combine design research, foresight, and systems thinking, and apply it in as many different spaces as I could. And I was really fortunate to be able to do work with a lot of first-gen immigrant youth in Toronto, working with the federal government, working on healthcare projects where we used visualizing complex systems as a way to try to trigger policy changes, or at least have different kinds of policy discussions about what's needed. And a lot of my healthcare work that I got involved in was around cancer care and oncology. Futures Festival, as I was just saying, was it's an online conference actually. And when we started in 2018, when I took it over, it was a closed door 75 people event. And there were actually very few, if any, other futures conferences that were about trying to bring in a lot of diverse voices into the fore, and about saying that you don't have to know the language of foresight and futures and futurists to engage in this discussion. Anybody doing long-term social change is actually practicing foresight at its most like real sense, because that to me is what foresight and futures work is really about. And so, you know, over the course of 4 years, these are the different banners that we had, the different kinds of themes that we had, but really it was all about inclusion and having an ability to include people from all over the world who are doing, you know, different kinds of systems work. So we went from 75 people closed event in 2017 when I took it over to having about 700 registrations and active participation over the course of 12 hours of concurrent programming on 2 channels. So like 22 hours of programming in a day that we would put together. And it was something I'm really proud of. And I think it was I really look forward to bringing it back next year. And we're going to do a twist in terms of how we engage people. But we also started actually when online conferences weren't really that much of a thing. It's hard to imagine that 2018 is when we weren't all on Zoom, but believe it or not, there wasn't that much happening online. So it's kind of fascinating to see how far we've come. Some of my projects that I really, really enjoyed doing that were I never even imagined doing them when I was an auditor. It had to do with experiential installations and immersive theater. Perhaps some of you in this room have a more creative background, but these were really eye-opening for me because all the work was around social justice issues. So these are two different installations. One is called Nature Pod, one was NDD Clinic, so the Nature Deficit Disorder Clinic. And I'll get into some profound changes even after this work. This took place in 2015 and 2016 for me. But these were immersive installations in public spaces around social justice issues like healthcare access, income inequality, just decreasing green space in our cities, so urbanization. And the whole goal was if we could engage as many senses as possible so that it doesn't become just an academic or intellectual exercise. How do people go from saying, this isn't my problem because I'm privileged, or I don't really see this affecting me, to something that gets us to just feel things and leave feeling things, and hopefully somewhere along the lines change that to, if it affects one of us, maybe it affects all of us, because we can't imagine feeling these things. And I really enjoyed doing them because I felt a profound appreciation for what theater is, but also when you can engage people in the theater and you get to be who you are when you walk into this installation. So I don't change Tina and Tina's experiences. I just give Tina a role where she draws who she is. And to me, that really, I'd never really experienced something like this before. Another type of creative space or creative project for me was this project called Reclaiming Artifacts. It was a community arts project funded by Canada's National Ceramics Museum. So a lot of my early work, actually, I should just share, is based in Canada. It's funded by the Gardner Museum, which is Canada's National Ceramics Museum. And they were in this move to also, as might have been the case in Australia, to decolonize their institution. And I think hopefully we've come a long way from using terms like decolonize, from surface things to much more profound shifts. But in their hope to open their doors to a broader part of Toronto, they were funding different projects. And we did a futures project with young people in a heavily gentrifying neighborhood in Toronto called Lawrence Heights, that had been going through gentrification for the past decade and was home to a lot of first-gen immigrant families who were essentially being moved out, obviously for brand new condominiums to be built. And this is happening all over Toronto and perhaps in your cities as well. And the whole point of this project was that young people, and especially young first-gen women of color, young girls of color, they don't get their voices heard. They certainly don't get them heard in national museums. And we had an amazing team of people doing this project where Cal and I were the design leads. But part of our team was actually trauma-informed facilitators and just arts facilitators from the neighborhoods where we were doing the work, and that some of those partnerships were actually facilitated by the museum. And it was, for me, an incredibly influential project. These young women went from people we recruited actually in a mall cafeteria because no one showed up to our call. And from the get-go, I learned so much actually of like what you think it's like to engage young people and what does it actually take. And I'm really grateful for the team that we had, because there was a lot of sharing and the trust that these young people, young women gave to us to share and to open up and create these artifacts. And essentially the ask was, if you could avoid taking gentrification so personally and think about it in waves, because it is personal, right? Their whole lives are being uprooted. But if you could think that actually in a few years' time, a few decades' time, there'll be another wave of gentrification. And if there was a developer, again, digging through the rubble, what would they find that would remind them that they lived here before? So they made very deeply personal pieces. And the whole point was to reinforce that everyone's narratives matter, and their stories matter. And they left the project having been artists who've been exhibited, which was really amazing to help support. A very different project from the last two is I worked with the federal government, and I was managing for a short time, managing a project around client-centric policy. And the whole goal was that the Canadian government is actually quite progressive in how it wants to engage citizens. And they wanted to engage young people in making policies, not at the very end of a policy cycle, but throughout the policy cycle, life cycle. And so the whole point of engaging futures was about opening up who we consult for me. So we created all these different, what you're seeing is actual templates of very simple tools or very simple sort of questions that we use to engage young people. And we did this project with Inuit youth in the north of Canada through workshops, as well as in 3 or 4 other cities across Canada. And, you know, part of it was having young people reflect on who is it that they want to be, but also what kind of supports did they need? And what is their own role in the kind of changes they want to see of their society and their community, their family, but also the government. And hopefully have the government see different kinds of inputs and different kinds of consultations and focus groups. And I really appreciate the openness they had to trust in different kinds of workshops, you know, that aren't the way that maybe a lot of focus groups are done. And another very different example for me is I was really fortunate to be part of a collaboration called EFFECT for about 3.5 years in Toronto. And EFFECT stood for Experiments in Feminist Ethical Collaborative Tools and Technologies. And you can see why we called it EFFECT. But it was really a cross-sector, multidisciplinary partnership amongst academics in the US, in Canada and outside, but also people who were running startups, who were running different kinds of creative spaces, supporting entrepreneurs, as well as community organizations that were working on women's rights, sexual violence, youth rights and spaces. And one of the organizations in Toronto, I worked on co-authoring digital media literacy curriculum for and with marginalized and racialized youth on sexual violence and oppression online. And it was called, one of the facilitator handbooks we wrote was called What Happens on the Internet. It was a meme making exercise to express how young people experience online, but also to imagine for young people who are actually often faced with these sexual violence and oppression, even in person, and then they face it online, to imagine what could it be like to experience these spaces without these elements. What would that look like for them? What would it look like for any young people to not have to think that this is something they have to interact with? And a lot of this work around feminist ways of working were practiced by this group. You know, it was a 3-year partnership, and the first 1.5 years was just spent on trust building between METRAC, which was the organization in Toronto, and all of us on the other side. And I think we don't often have a lot of funders who actually fund different kinds of community change work or community engagement work where that much time for trust building is accepted. In fact, we didn't even decide what the partnership was going to be until that much later. And I think, unfortunately, I've realized that, you know, that's pretty rare, at least in the spaces that I had exposure to work in. Now, again, a different space of work for me was while I was in grad school. I started grad school in 2014, and I decided to go part-time after a little while and took a few years off to start my practice and do all these different projects and just experience what is it really like to do foresight work, especially at a time where foresight and futures wasn't really that in. It started to become a lot more in, and a lot of people started using these terms about 3-4 years into my engagement in the foresight world. So in 2019, I actually, for my thesis, authored a framework and a sort of a dynamic framework called Lotus. And it's on my website. It's not dynamic at the moment, though. But it was an anti-colonial equity-based framework. And the whole point was all my work and a lot of my leadership spaces in APF, there was this profound realization of just at the time how Western-centric the practice was, and certain modalities of work in foresight space are about parachuting in and out of different communities to do futures work, especially communities that people are not from. And I wanted to create something which was just asking people reflective questions, because my goal isn't to tell you what to do. I just wanted to create space for us to question our own belief systems, our own worldviews, our own ways of knowledge making and knowledge respecting as practitioners. When you go into communities, if you answered a variety of different questions and asked yourself, am I following certain principles of inclusive design? You know, how could that inform the work that you do when you go into communities and spaces? And so Lotus was one way to do that. And it was meant to be a public asset. It was meant to connect to research, is meant to connect to research of practitioners in other spaces as well, who are maybe, you know, somebody who's maybe done a whole PhD on time and different kinds of time, you know, to create basically a connection point. And this was really, I really feel profoundly grateful that I got about 4 months to just think and write. And now that I work, as maybe you can all relate to, you realize how little time you get to just deep dive into something and spend all your aching energy on it. And Lotus actually ended up winning the Next Gen Foresight Global Award in 2019. And it's been something that I continuously engage with and share with others. It's on the website. If you want to just check it out, I probably does a better job on it on the website actually than I'm doing at the moment. But the whole goal is, if you're doing something, if you're planning an engagement, this is a framework that could maybe ask you certain questions about how you're designing it. And I'd be really curious if you ever did get to use it, if there was anything that surfaced for you that helped influence your engagement with the community. Now, obviously, after 2019, the pandemic hit. And I would have to say that a lot of my creative work stopped at that point. I'd also just joined the UN. But one work I did get to do during pandemic was with a coalition of other women practitioners globally, led by Changeist, if you've heard of them. But it was commissioned by the International Women's Development Agency, or IWDA, and they were actually looking to do work in the Pacific with women, and wanted us to create some sort of a framework that could actually open up the space to imagine feminist futures after COVID-19 in the Pacific. And we really engaged and thought a lot about forces, different patriarchal forces, different kinds of social norms that have become so normalized for us that if we could call them out, what would that surface for us as, and how could we, once we've named them, allow us to sort of bring into place in these futures very different realities or possibilities. So it was really just about creating space to articulate and question, how does patriarchy in its many different dimensions and spaces, how do gender normative, oppressive aspects and elements, or even, you know, doesn't have to all be oppressive and negative, but like, how do things that actually open you up and give you space to be who you are, how much of that are you letting in and how much is not allowed? And how can you let more of it in? And it's a free tool online as well if you want to check it out and engage with it. And these are all work in progresses. But if there's suggestions, I always would love to hear it. And there's others who were involved in this project with me. A lot of my work for the last 3.5 years now, again, very different from the work before, has been with the UN, and in particular with United Nations Development Program, which is the largest UN agency under the UN umbrella. And UNDP works primarily with governments as our partners. So you would have heard of UNICEF, that works primarily with children and also women. UNEP, which is all about environment. UN Women, of course, which focuses on women programming. UNDP covers all of that, and all the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals fall under their umbrella. A lot of my work in the innovation team and Asia Pacific Hub for the first 2 years, and as an independent consultant in the last 1.5 years, has been around how do we introduce foresight within UN agencies? Again, because it's been done in the last few years, but how do we build internal capacity? How do we use thinking about the future to unpack conversations in our own teams and offices about we get funded for 2-3 year project life cycles, but the change we're trying to do is systemic and generational at the minimum. Those are contradictory in many ways. When you're planning for 1 to 2 year cycles, but the change is so long term, how do we use foresight as a way to think about the kind of long-term change we're doing and hopefully start to influence the ways in which we think of project life cycles? How do we actually use futures as a way to think about the kind of change we really want to see, not just the kind of change that we think other people want to hear about? And a lot of the work externally was, after the pandemic in this region, there's a lot more demand for anticipatory ways of making policy and of thinking of governance. Whereas, before and still there's a lot of data, there's a lot of emphasis on empirical data-based policy. And I'm sure if any of you are part of that policy-making space or hear any of these languages, there's a lot of data-driven policy-making. What could be a different kind of data was essentially the provocation here, right? In qualitative data. And how do we weave aspects that are cross-cutting, like gender, climate change, and socioeconomic inequity and inequality into this work, in all the work that I was putting forth with teams. I put the slide in, although I feel like it's quite, I don't know, it's very specific, but I just wanted to showcase, for example, when we're working with governments, there's generally sort of an illustrative policy cycle that resonates with most bureaucrats and policymakers, which is that, there's a certain cycle happening, and that we don't say as foresight practitioners that you aren't already monitoring for events for what might make your policy become irrelevant, or might make your policy be in danger of not covering all its bases. But when you bring foresight in, it just sort of institutionalizes and formalizes a different way in which we need to monitor events, which is actually also trying to anticipate different kinds of a range of future events, right? Because policymakers are also anticipating future events when they're monitoring things. It's not that they're not, but how might we actually make and formalize making implications, widespread implications, a part of the ways in which we're evaluating the relevance and of our policies? How can we use scenarios, and not just scenarios, but a slew of other different ways in which we can make people think about different responses that are needed by the government and the timeframes in which those responses are needed? Because when we lag, as we've seen with technology, there are widespread implications in furthering inequity and creating new forms of inequity that we couldn't have really anticipated for before. I just wanted to add, because the last 3.5 years of my life has been with in the Asia and the Pacific region and working with policy spaces, I just wanted to share some reflections, which is, in the Asia and the Pacific, a lot of examples of governments who used to use foresight when I was always, trying to create decks, were coming from Japan, South Korea, Singapore, or Malaysia, and very few other countries, which was the majority of people I was working with in the region, could relate to these countries, even though they're in our region. And what's been really amazing is post-COVID-19, we've seen a lot more, not just interest, but actually projects that are being initiated at state level, city level, very few at the federal level or national level, but there's a couple. But we're seeing a lot more things come up in India, in Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, like I've listed here, just to name some. And I've done trainings with some members of a team in Timor-Leste, so all different kinds of governments, but very few have gone through full cycles of work, policy work, and very few have written about it. So even now, looking for examples, it's hard to find them. But if you look for things, you'll see them. There's things that are happening. People are using them. But one observation for me, obviously, as somebody who really is very interested in and practices a lot of participatory foresight work, is that very few governments in the newer tranche are actually using strategic foresight beyond an anticipatory governance thing, as in, what should we as a government be keeping our eye out for? Very few are using it in the participatory capacity. So how do we design with citizens and residents very intentionally throughout entire life cycles, using foresight as one way to engage people? And I think it has a lot to do with the kinds of civic spaces that are available to us and the kinds of spaces for dissent and for disagreement. And those are just the realities of the world we live in. But they certainly influence the ways in which a very dynamic field like foresight is used or can be used in countries. The next part of what I wanted to share with you was essentially reflecting on all these different spaces that I've gotten to explore and play with have definitely influenced my work and my thinking. And one big piece was, just like futures became quite big a few years ago, I'm sure you can all relate to the fact that the term decolonization was being used just about everywhere about 2 years ago. And I want to acknowledge that, as a not just a term, but as a practice, as a field of work, decolonization is definitely rooted and has been rooted in the movement of Indigenous sovereignty. And it was definitely a term that has been co-opted by many fields, including the foresight and futures world. But I think there's a lot to learn from it, even if we should respectfully sort of distance ourselves from certain terminology. There's a lot to learn from what decolonization actually, while rooted in the Indigenous sovereignty movement, really was meant to articulate, ask, and challenge, which was, it was about asking us to actively question the very origins and of the ethos and like knowledge production that underpin basically every field of study and work that exists around us, and of economic models, of course, ways of doing, and arguably for me, and I think for many foresight practitioners, our imagination, what has influenced what we imagine, and part of, being colonial entities. I don't know about you, but I can certainly relate that in my childhood, if you speak to most people in India, although I didn't all grow up in India, to be quite honest, I only spent a few years, and my parents were diplomats, so I grew up moving my whole life. But no matter where I moved, certain authors like Enid Blyton, certain stories, Oliver Twist, these were the stories that, everybody was reading all around the world. And certainly in India, if you ask most people, British authors were it for a lot of people. And so decolonization is also meant to ask us to stop, not just stop there in terms of what is the basis of these different fields of work and these models that exist around us, but also to ask us around how are we thinking? What are we thinking about? And to challenge ourselves to invite alternatives into the space. Because I think the most important thing for us is, I think, when we're thinking in the futures world, we create what we imagine. And so if our imagination is colonized, it's a pretty significant power. And so how do we ultimately challenge power, and how power is constructed in every possible imaginable way is, I think, what decolonization is also asking us to do. And I think while we should distance ourselves from certain terms that I think are being co-opted, can we instead, for me, has meant, how do I decenter certain dominant narratives and influences, particularly Western ones, where they're not the best suited ones, right? Where there's alternatives, where there's different forms of thinking and ways of doing and making sense. How do we decenter in those spaces? How do we prioritize equity? How do we prioritize inclusiveness? And a result of all of these three to me is, how do we make space for plurality? That there's more than one way of knowing, more than one way of doing, more than one way of thinking. And I really feel quite strongly about that. And I think a lot of my upbringing of growing up in very different spaces and as an adult living in very different places reinforces that for me. And I think futures for me is also a beautiful field of work, because it heavily relies on redefining things, and we can redefine them if we are willing to challenge things. I promise I actually only have a few more things to go, but for me, some fundamental questions that I ask myself is, who's invisible? Even when I'm reading things, like, who's invisible in these images and stories? And when they're visible, how are they visible? Who is being heard? Who doesn't actually get to speak, or when they do get to speak is suppressed or silenced? Which in whose knowledge is deemed credible, respectable, which in whose knowledge is not? Who do you cite? This was actually a profound realization when I was also doing my master's thesis. And I probably say profound a lot because I was an accountant about 12 years ago again. So for me, these are all very profound realizations, because this is an entirely different field of work. And until I was writing my master's, I was trying to bring in a lot of feminist theory and integrate that and weave that into my Foresight work. Who we cite is who we cite in our research is a very real way in which power is constructed and continued. And citing very diverse sources is really critical. But when a lot of what you have access to is in English, sometimes you don't even have access to the full depth of what's there, right? So there's so many layers to this that inform who we get to read about. But I think this is a really big one for me that I know maybe isn't relevant to everyone here if you're not an academic or don't engage in academia and writing. But certainly hit home when I was doing a lot more research work. I think it's really valuable, no matter what field of work you come in, to ask the question of who benefits from X. And X could be policies, regulations you're working with, programs that you're doing in any, be it UN, be it a community organization, be it a museum, be it a university, housing markets, tech services, tech apps. Who benefits from something and who is excluded from something? And whose rights are respected, both in terms of people, but the environment and nature, and whose are not? And asking the question of how is power playing out in a particular space? And for me, all of these different questions, I created my own sort of summaries of things from all this different work, which was obviously that this work is not stat. These are basically a list of, they're not principles, but they're maybe points that I keep in my I guess insights from different work, which is that this work is obviously not static, and this being all of this work, this field, it you know, or I suppose it's any work that you're doing, your inner work, any work you're doing is probably not static, you know. As you learn more, your understanding evolves, and certainly in the futures field, it's not naturally inclined by itself. If you look at a lot of mainstream tools as well, they're not naturally inclined to be pro-feminist, intersectional, equitable, or anti-colonial in any way. You actually have to care enough about any of these things and layer on this lens to any of the tools that currently are used in mainstream Foresight work. And that falls upon you as a practitioner, your responsibility to do that. Part of doing the Lotus framework was to take that responsibility away from people and make it part of a framework so that you didn't have to think about those things. The other change that was for me quite, again, I can't get away from the word profound, I'm sorry, which was like, we use the word future everywhere, and actually there is no singular future. There's only the possibility of futures. There's no singular future, and there never is. No one experiences even the same second, the same moment in the same way, right? And so in that multiplicity is a plurality. And of course, in the future going forward, there's no single thing happening all around the world in any moment. And using the futures as a plural became something I'm so much more conscious to, because it also feels like when it's a singular term, it feels like such a power play to make you believe that there's only one inevitability when there isn't. Another thing for me became around how do we practice something that's life-centered versus human-centered? How do we design anything, be it policy, infrastructure, tech, programming, products? How does all of that get altered if we considered the potential implications on all other life, because we're fundamentally interconnected? And so how do we shift away from just prioritizing people and people's needs to actually more than just human need? How do we consider environmental impacts in everything, in every aspect of design and decision making? How do we plant seeds of hope, not fear, and bring people along? And I don't know if you remember when we were talking about installations earlier, when I was sharing those examples, the titles were Nature Pod and Nature Deficit Disorder. I realized in some of my own initial work, I was going to fear as the primary emotion that these installations would trigger as a way to get a response from people. And I started to realize just how quickly and how easy it is for us to tap into fear. And I think the biggest challenge I've given to myself in the space of work now is, how do I actually not prioritize or tap into fear, which I think is easier, but tap into hope, which is a lot more complex and a lot harder to bring people with you, because hope somehow feels a lot easier for us to disregard, and fear somehow feels a lot more universal, or is a lot more universal. I hope what I've also shared with you in sharing my different projects is this emphasis on intersectionality. And I think being at the UN, this has definitely been reinforced to me, because we need to acknowledge, first of all, of course, that people live beyond any binaries, but how do we not design for generic identities? In a lot of our work, we use things like leave no one behind, vulnerable men and women, vulnerable women and youth. And these terms are used a lot. And this is not a criticism to anything in the development space, but this is just how we speak. And I think what can be easily forgotten is that there's no such thing as just a singular homogenous group called vulnerable women and youth, or men, or LGBTQIA+. There's different needs with different people, and we really need to bring intersectionality and to understand what makes up these groups of people and how are their needs differing and different, even if they are all somewhere, somehow vulnerable, or identify with certain genders. The last 2 points for me, at least if they resonate also with you, and if you have others, please, I hope in the Q&A and the discussion we can bring them up, is how do we bring an intergenerational lens to this work, which seems fundamental to futures work because we're talking about long range. But actually, it's very easy for us to not use this word and or to not use the concept of intergenerationality. And it's very important to remind, especially the clients you might be working with or yourself, how do we think of future generations in our own decision making? And I think if we brought that into the different decisions we take every day, let alone big decisions, I'm pretty sure we would make different decisions. Last is can we look for power and how power is centered and how is it playing out in the spaces that we're operating in? And how do we somehow commit to interrogate or challenge it as needed? And to remember for all of us who especially facilitate workshops and spaces, that actually how we organize a room is also reflective of how we're choosing to organize for power in that room. And working with different communities that I have gotten a chance to work with, specifically structurally marginalized communities, these were some things that I've learned on doing different projects, which is thinking about the future is something I think when you come from middle class, upper middle class families, we take for granted, I think, because they're very normal parts of our family conversations, I think. But actually for a very large percentage of people, thinking about the future is very much seen as a privilege, not a right. So how do we make people feel comfortable with the future enough in the engagements that we do with them that lets them know that actually they have just as much a right, but how can we make it less triggering so that they can engage with it and distance it from being a privilege? And a big part of that for me has become from taking time to build trust and having commitment to the people we're working with and having genuine interest in their lives. And funding doesn't often create space for this. And so how do we advocate for this from our funders? And that I think true project success really depends on trust. And I think this holds true for any kind of work you do, regardless of just that with particularly marginalized communities or structurally marginalized communities. How do we resist parachuting in and out from projects, especially if you don't have any context before? And if that is the only way to operate, how do we actually create longevity in a different way, which is building a network with community of partners? And actually, how could you transfer some of your future's knowledge with local facilitators within those community partners so that when you leave, you're actually leaving knowledge behind, you're leaving futures practice behind with people who are intimately familiar and comfortable with the community where there's trust. But now you've also left them with a different way of engaging and, different knowledge sharing. How do we challenge all our assumptions, especially when you work in communities that you might not be familiar with? And so I wrote poverty example because there was a really interesting talk that happened while I was at UNDP, and there was a practitioner speaking about the work that in development world, we do a lot of poverty alleviation programming. And the fundamental assumption of that is that poverty has to do with not having money. And when they were doing work in a certain community, when they actually asked people after a while what poverty meant for them. Poverty didn't have to do with lack of money. Poverty had to do with not having family and being socially isolated. And that's what you are poor if you don't have social connection. And that was the way in which the community defined poverty. But as development workers, we defined it purely as when you don't have money. And so when the whole basis of your programming is so fundamentally disconnected from that of the people you're working with, because you just think there could be no other definition. Just a reminder that actually challenging all your assumptions, even if you've used that word in a particular way your whole life, doesn't make it universal. And part of that then gets to the next point, which is that when you do find people think about things very fundamentally differently from you, you have to be willing to let go of all your design plans, especially if it doesn't sit with the community. And so maybe a better yet option, again, often not very liked by funders, is to wait to design once you've actually gotten to know people and understand their context. And so again, a lot of advocacy work is needed with our funders to actually fund with more trust, and to fund with more flexibility, and to fund with putting community in the forefront. And so the last point for me that I've thought a lot about for my work was, how do you go the extra mile to design with care? And to go the extra mile means fundamentally that as practitioners, we have to be inconvenienced, and we have to not let to control things when we want to do them. That means everything from, how you design, of course, but the simple decision actually of what you serve as food when you go into certain communities. When we ran a workshop in a particular community, it only had access to fast food, and everybody that did a workshop there before only generally fed participants the same garbage that was available there. And it literally is garbage. And it's really sad that this is what, is the reality of food deserts. We, on our planes, lugged fresh fruit with us when we went in here. And this was part of that consideration of, if we want to do different, we have to actually show up in as many aspects of our design differently. And this is not to applaud myself in that work, but just to share even that just simple decision of what you're going to serve. If you can be more thoughtful, it goes a long way to show a community how much you're thinking about them. How do you compensate people for their time? How do you offer childcare? When do you run your sessions? Maybe these are things that are things that you all think about. I have to be honest, I've been in spaces where this is not the primary thought or something that we consider all the time. How you organize your room, how do you open and close a session? Who does that? Who leads with you? Who co-facilitates with you? Who and what do you acknowledge? So here we talk a lot about land versus, there's a LinkedIn post that I just read literally yesterday, which is about from an Indigenous consultant, an Indigenous person as well in Toronto who also leads consulting work, and they were talking about land acknowledgements versus territory acknowledgements, and small differentiations that are actually paradigm shifts in terms of what are we acknowledging? How can we be much more transformative in what we acknowledge versus tokenistic? So anyways, these were really a lot of things for me that have come out through being exposed to this work, of working in different spaces, and some of my reflections of how Foresight work is done and how we can challenge it in small and simple ways. And I think all of this really still matters because we have very urgent convergent crises. More and more in our more developed, more global north, non-Indigenous global north spaces, there's dynamics that are changing. What we used to relegate to as, issues and realities of the global south are no longer just that. Tables they're flipping, and there's social movements that are widespread and they're powerful. And I think there's a real space for Foresight to be a stronger ally in social movements, which is, I think, maybe something you realize, that actually the Foresight space and futurists and Foresight practitioners, however you label yourself, aren't actually very actively present side by side to a lot of social movements, when actually we're a field that's perfectly poised for that. I just wanted to share the last 3 slides are really just things I'm dreaming of course, a lot of my work is still UN. And that's a very different space of operating. But I've been craving in my body, and I just wanted to put it out there and share with you, and hopefully open up the discussion for the kinds of projects you're all thinking and dreaming about. But I have been feeling in my body a desire to do something very big and creative and futures related, always social justice related. And I have no idea what it's going to be, where, when, with whom, but I guess I'm just kind of saying it to manifest it and to put it out because I've been feeling it for a long time. And now that we're on the other side of COVID, well, I don't know, that seems like an ignorant statement, but while we're on the other side of whatever we are on the other side of, it feels like a good space to do some more work. And a project that I am working on with the School of International Futures. They're another institute or organization, rather, if you're not familiar with them, to look them up. They actually fund every year a series of practitioners you can apply to their Next Gen Foresight Practitioners Award, and they have a series of different categories. And if you win, you do get money sometimes for your projects, and you get access to a large global community of practitioners who are trying to challenge different normative ways of being and working. And we've gotten some funding from an external funder for this work called Futures Methods from Around the World. And currently I'm the creative lead on this work. And the whole goal is, how do we actually learn about different ways that different cultures or different practitioners are suggesting that offer us a reframe from normative and sort of dominant ways of thinking and doing? And how do we create an open depository of these different methods so that you can access them and interrogate them and, you know, challenge yourself with, have I thought about it this way until now or not? And the last work that I've been sort of squirreling away for the past year is a project on gender and relationships. And I wanted to spend this time because I think we can dream. And a lot of work in the gender space and the development space is relegated to women. And I actually think we need to engage all genders in this space of work. And I think how we relate to ourselves affects how we are in relationship with others. And so a lot of this work is rooted in emotional literacy work and being in healthy relationships with ourselves. And it's been a long time since I've spoken so much, so I will stop there and just say, let's be radical, whatever that means for us. I don't think radical has to be huge. It can be about what you challenge and question. And the last slide I have is this, which is, I don't know if many of you have read Sultana's Dream. I don't know if you can raise your hands, but have any of you heard of this book, the short story? Sultana's Dream is actually the first science fiction stories that was actually written by a woman, and she happens to have been Indian, but at the time Indian. Now it's what is now Bangladesh, but it was written in 1905 by a Bengali Muslim author, Ruqya Sakawat Hussain. And it's actually a really interesting short story. I actually read it for the first time during the pandemic. And it's astonishing to me that it was written in 1905 and we're in 2023, and how much of this is still relevant. But she's actually challenging a lot of Islamic patriarchy and a lot of patriarchy as it was being experienced in India at the time. But she wakes up in this space where women are actually leading every aspect of work. And I don't know if you can notice at the bottom, there's in Urdu, it's called parda, which is literally stands for curtain. But the men are in a lot of Islamic cultures, you might have heard or read about the fact that women are, and even in India and actually in Hinduism and in Indian and Hindu conservative families, women are behind curtains, right? Women cover their faces. Here, the men are the ones that are behind it in this story. And essentially, really, she's walking in this sort of revolutionary nation that is run by women. There's solar energy, there's planes in 1905. But really, feminist science here, which is underpinning a lot of what's happening in this fictional space, is seeking knowledge and peace. It's not after wealth and power. And in that way, she's challenging the way in which science can actually lead us to positive and more inclusive spaces, and challenge the kind of gender norms that have been put upon people. And I wanted to put that out there because I think it's just sharing different literature as well is revolutionary in its own way. We get to learn about different cultures and spaces. And I just wanted to end with that. And thanks so much for all your time and for the space.
Thank you, Prateeksha. I loved everything that you've shared, and definitely reflecting on everything you've shared as well. The comment, especially the intergenerational sort of framing, really stuck with me to think about, featuring and, the line of work and the conversations we might want to prompt. Without taking up the space, I'd love to throw it to the room. If you have any question and you want to ask, you can either put your hand up or you can either put in the comments and we can read some of them as well. Who would like to go first?
I'm going to click open the best Barbie article.
Yeah, do you know Slavoj Zizek? He's a
Sorry?
Have you heard of Slavoj Zizek?
Yes.
Yeah, it's an article he wrote about, I don't know when it was, not very long ago, last month, when Barbie and Oppenheimer opened. By far and away the best Barbie article that I've seen. I mean, he's brilliant, but the article is excellent. But more importantly, that image is so beautiful, the image that you just showed. But I think it's magical because there's an Architectural Digest story that I also linked there, which shows the architecture of the dream house from Barbie Land. And it's so amazing. That what year did you say that illustration is from?
That illustration is actually a newer illustration. It's actually, I think, done by a Pakistani visual artist who was visualizing Sultana's dream in her interpretation. But this is at least 2-3 years old, so it's before Barbie for sure.
It's just beautiful that it's beautiful anyway, and the story's beautiful too. But it's very interesting how things, I don't know, mimic each other.
For sure. I don't think, I don't think what we're speaking about is relegated to just like one community of people, right? And I'm going to put the name of the illustrator who actually is the one who depicted Sultana's dream. And she is, I found it on Twitter actually, and put that in.
Thank you. Susie.
Hey, thank you so much for that. It was so great to hear an overview of your practice and also possible future directions. So I guess two of the things that really struck out for me based on your experience as well was your comment around how we design or the civic spaces available for participatory practices. And so I guess I have two questions. Like, one is also how one does or how one creates the conditions to do participatory futures work, like it's so funding dependent and time dependent. So for context, I work at UTS with Sam at the University of Technology Sydney and do different kinds of participatory futures work, but predominantly within a learning and teaching environment where you kind of have more flexibility to kind of explore these different issues. So I guess one strand of that question is how have you found ways of creating more time, space, capacity for doing that participatory futures work, and then also something around the actual civic spaces available for doing that, and where have you found maybe better spaces for doing that than others?
Thanks. One of those that comment in particular was also targeted, I think, when I was talking about a lot of the work in the region, and there is a lot of as you may agree, that I think there's a shrinking civic space in many countries, specifically in the region, certainly in many of the countries that I work with and work around. And for me, I mean, a lot of my work in the civic spaces was mostly in Canada. And I actually started to do some work in India and had to find some creative spaces, basically creative funding opportunities. So there's, you know, an organization that funds for different kinds of gender-based discussions, and they are really open to very creative practices as part of this, and they try to fund you, right, if they approve you. So I'm always looking, I have to look for spaces that are quite alternative when I'm working in the Asia Pacific region, in my experience, where these opportunities are fewer, and they're actually a lot more related to arts and creative spaces than, say, Canada, where I think there's a lot more mainstream funding available for, you know, different kinds of social inclusion, different kinds of participatory work. Whatever medium you use, you can use Foresight, but you could use something else. So I find that in this region, for me, my experience has been to have to find very niche spaces. And sadly, not sadly, I don't know, a lot of these spaces for me have come in the art space. But I think that the sad part for me is that it shouldn't be the art space alone that funds for these kinds of alternative engagements. And we should take the arts a lot more seriously as a more normal, everyday thing that we engage in. So I guess, again, to go back to your question, for me, it's always been around who can fund these spaces, unless you're willing to, I guess, put up your own. There's also not as much ability to do guerrilla type work often, or maybe in some spaces in Asia, actually, there's a lot less control over public spaces. So you could do more guerrilla installation type work where you don't need to seek permission. At the same time, it can be quite messy for all the above reasons. And in Canada, like I said, I just found there's so much more access to different kinds of funding, and different kinds of civic conversations were already happening around decolonizing institutions, decolonizing public spaces. And there was a lot more money that was available. And in Canada in particular, also because of the reconciliation work that's happening between, you know, settler colonial state and Indigenous First Nations peoples. And so again, that's opened up a whole different stream of funding in those spaces. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but we certainly don't have that kind of leverage or funding spaces in India, Thailand, and other spaces.
You, Joshua?
Hi. I'm trying to like synthesize my thoughts. But I'll try not to wind on too much. But yeah, that was really, really great. I really like super interested. I'm kind of worried though that all of a sudden everyone went on this journey between design, systems design, and then installation art. I haven't heard many people describe it before, and I'm like, oh, maybe I wasn't so like unique. Anyway, I really like connected with that like journey through those things. But my question is, like you do your reflection work after like projects and different things, and then I was kind of wondering if there were any, I don't know, it's kind of like a weird meta question, if there are any moments where like, I guess that you kind of looked back on it and there was a big change in how you were reflecting on things. The winding part is that like, I kind of had a similar moment, and it connects with some of your reflections in that with like decolonization and the things that like, what can people imagine? What can we imagine? Actually, one of the people who is part of this group, Scott Matter, when I was working with him, he introduced me to like the discourse of development and shared a bunch of articles from Arturo Escobar with me. And after reading that, it was like a whole week of me just being like, holy shit, my worldview is wrong. Like, and so like that moment, I kind of went back and looked at all the, I guess, assumptions I'd made and all the things that I'd kind of distilled down and gone, oh, these are like not what I thought they were anymore. And I started to change those. And I was kind of wondering if I don't know if you had any moments like that, like any really pivotal things that that kind of on top of those, I guess, already reflections. If that's actually a question. Sorry.
No. I don't know if I got this, but I was putting it in the chat. One of the most profound pieces, again, I don't know why, I really don't use the word profound as much, but one of the pieces that was quite seminal and had like a real influence on me was reading some of the work this Kenyan author whose name I will not be able to pronounce, but I'm sure some of you have read him and heard of him. And he writes about the influence that obviously the British and other colonizers had on his own experiences growing up, and just his realizations and reflections on the power. The biggest legacy of colonization has been colonizing our imagination, colonizing what we think we can like reach for and grasp when we think about things. And and I don't know if this is tying to your question, but some of the biggest reflections for me have come from like, wait, what do I think of when I think of my childhood, when I think of these stories, when I think of what I'm thinking about or imagining? And am I limiting the work that I do, even as questions that I ask participants, the way in which I ask them? Because ultimately, unless we talk to other people who are really different from us, I don't know if we often have spaces, no matter how much reflection you do. It's like Johari's witness. This is Johari's window, sorry, right? That, have you guys heard of that mechanism of like what you know, and like trying to get yourself to reflect on your unknown unknowns, right? Like as a reflection practice. I will quickly Google it and put it in the chat. But anyways, those were some of the tools that I was also using and putting into this sort of space of reflection, which is what do I access, and how does, when I access in my mind, and how is that influencing, limiting, or opening up what I put forth? And can I accomplish that in some way?
Yeah, that's really like helpful, insightful too. Because that moment of like is also what I have, where it's when I think about a thing, like how is it I obviously realized in the development moment, like how that had limited kind of the scope of what I thought about as like norms and things, and how that impacted on the shape of the questions I would ask in a facilitated meeting or something. And then how, if like taking it internally and then being able to like you need new experiences to reevaluate things in new ways and to learn from different cultures, and I guess to really hear them, but then also how to, like, when you're in a space, help other people be okay to like do that too. I think that's where your answer is very helpful.
I want to pick up on something you said, because I think we're so used to being well-traveled, or like having people go to different spaces, but actually being well-traveled doesn't actually mean that you're open to having your worldviews, your belief systems be challenged. People who navigate multiple spaces, who on the surface are extremely well-traveled, but I don't think at the very core want some of the things that they hold to be challenged, because it would fundamentally be inconveniencing you. It would fundamentally be giving up something. So I just want to put that, you made a very important point, which is you have to be open to actually hearing things and sitting with any discomfort that comes to you.
Well, we can thank Arturo Escobar for that. In my case,
good books and good articles.
Thank you so much. I'll let other people go now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So we are coming up to time. Also, Prateeksha need to go to bed. I've got many more questions, but I can probably ask them in my own time. Any other last question before we wrap up?
I was just going to ask one thing. What you were just saying then about people not being well-traveled and not necessarily being open to things. Do you think that it's possible for people to be, for everybody to be open? Do you think that we're so conditioned to the ideological constraints in which we already exist, that we just, it's not possible?
Maybe to me, it's about mindset. Like, I definitely think I hold very strong ideological, like, ideas about things, but, and I'm not saying I am the most flexible human being. But I don't know if I got your question, which is, for me, when you're traveling and you're, there's that difference, which there's a silly Netflix movie out. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a travel agent. I haven't actually watched it, but she goes to Vietnam. Has anyone seen this come up on their Netflix? Okay, all right. But anyways, there's a moment as an ad. There's a very good looking Vietnamese travel agent she meets, or somebody anyways, while she's in Vietnam. And he goes, there's a difference between a traveler and a tourist. He's like, because a tourist is just going after, it's very romantically profound in whatever he's telling her in this rom-com, but it's essentially like, a tourist is just like going to go see things, but she's a traveler. She's really open to new experiences. And I really think it's your mindset that you take when you go to new spaces. If you're just going to go see things and checklist them, I don't even think you're probably in that mental space to be open to seeing things in different ways necessarily, unless they're so profound or they hit you in ways that you can't ignore them. But I do think if you're open to new experiences and to trying to understand how people live their lives, how they engage and interact with each other, then I think you're open to at least seeing them.
I sort of meant more from a colonized perspective and an ideological perspective, that we are fundamentally too deep to be able to, for example, decolonize the mind, if you will.
I personally think it's not going to happen overnight. I do think you can take, what is decolonizing the mind? I think there's like a million puzzle pieces that probably make up whoever you are. And I think you probably start with, like turning over one or two. And I think that probably leads to other things, but I don't think it's impossible. I mean, I would almost put it back to you, right? If you are so aware of how you grew up, would you say that you have actually challenged something that you grew up with that were so black and white for you, but aren't so black and white anymore?
I don't know that that's necessarily my intent or what I was asking. I just sort of I'm just quite interested from I guess from a dialectical materialist perspective. Whether I wonder whether it's possible to do that, or does it have to sort of, is it going to take generations to remove that generational damage that's been done?
I feel like you probably already I mean, I think any of this work is not going to happen over very short amount of time. I'm sure you're like so intimately aware of that, because I feel like even if you're asking this question, this sounds like something you've thought about. I don't know. This is my general assumption.
I'm working on a PhD, so I'm quite interested in
I'm like, this is not coming out of thin air.
No, it's something I think about a lot.
There's a whole thing that I also look into as part of that gender project, which is around parenting and conscious parenting, and ways in which we actually parent by deconstructing not just language, but like messaging. And I think those aren't going to happen again overnight. But I also think we need tools, not just tools, but like we need more public spaces where we have to ask people, do you even realize this is associated to that? And that there's another way of unpacking this. Again, I don't know if I'm getting your question, but as I think about this, right, and connect it to other work that I think about.
Let me put it to you a different way. What if you thought about I'm sure you've heard the quote, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. So how do you dismantle this house using the same tools.
But who said we're using the same tools?
I think that when you are fundamentally trapped inside the current ideological state, that it's difficult to see outside of it.
Again, I don't know if I haven't gotten your question right the last 4 tries, but like, let's say the futures methods around the world project.
Don't worry. It's just
no, don't worry. I don't take that in any wrong way. Like, it's all open for interpretation where I sit. But like part of the thinking behind, you know, like futures methods from around the world is there's, for example, 2 ways in which we're trying to surface. And the word methods is actually a very complicated thing. There's like multiple footnotes to that. But like when you look at the call that we have, which is like footnote methods are anything like blah, 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 blah. But the whole goal was what already exists in different cultures that we don't have access to, that already offers a reframe, offers an alternative, offers a different way of thinking around something that we, for the most part, think there's only one way of defining. Or are there people like us in this room, others like yourself who are doing PhDs, that might in the course of your PhD actually say, I haven't seen this anywhere, at least in my research, and I'm proposing this other way of thinking about X. So what futures methods from around the world is trying to do is actually trying to say from either of these sources, be it historic, rooted in different cultures, or be it in more contemporary practices that people have articulated themselves, are there things that can actually open us up to challenging things that we've taken for granted ideologically? Now, again, I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but this is some of the thinking behind some of that work. And I think it's very much possible. Definitely will take generations to have the kind of maybe, or a generation. I mean, it would take a generation of like uber concerted effort, which I don't think anyone can guarantee. But I don't think it's impossible.
Thank you, Prateeksha. So I'm aware we're coming up to 8. And once again, thank you so remember we have a hard stop, so you can go to bed. So once again, thank you so much for you sharing your experiences and also you know, your work and how you have been practicing Foresight. I again cannot say enough. I personally been dying to learn and wanted the community here from you, and I'm very glad I was able to connect you with our community in some way, and hopefully one day, not manifesting, you manifesting, also manifesting, maybe one day you come back to Sydney, we can do something together.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you so much for taking that time. We have Prateeksha has left her website and also her contact details. We'll also make sure we post it in a wrap up and sharing of that of this recording as well. So you can definitely reach out to her to reflect and ask her more questions, or you know, she's looking for creative partners, you know. So if you work on anything fun, like, you know, it's a 2-way street. You give some and you also win some. So please feel free to reach out to her.
That's good. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to actually joining other ones where I'm a participant on this side of this of the dynamic. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.